So just to say that this, the organisations involved in the running and the delivery of these are AQUA, that's the Advancing Quality Alliance, the Innovation Agency for the North West Coast, the Northwest Leadership Academy, Northwest ADAS, MIAA, and Northwest Employers. So that's the collaborative that's bringing this series of masterclasses for you today. In terms of the programme, I won't run it through in great detail. I will shortly introduce some of the speakers, but obviously we'll endeavour to make up the time, very quickly to get back on track. The plan is to run through till following the programme there. Plenty of breakout rooms, there's opportunities to have more interactive discussion and the like, and the plan is to wrap up for. Well, final comments at 12 for wrap up just after 12. There isn't a planned break, as you can see, any of the way through the programme this morning. So please do just grab yourselves a comfort break, tea, coffee, any sort of moment in time that suits yourselves. Now, my next job is just to introduce the facilitation panel for today. I don't know if I have a new slide to do that, Louise, or do I just run from where I am?
Sorry, Dave, I think Manar's just moving the slides on.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So my job really now is to introduce Adrian, and Adrian will then introduce Denise and Sunisha. So Adrian, as you can see from the slide, he's the founder and director of the Mental Health Consultants Organisation. A few words, I suppose, around Adrian is to say that he's worked for the best part of a decade now as a mental health campaigner, an educator and consultant. He's worked with various charities, notably SANE as the head of the Black Dog campaign, as well as many other corporate organisations. Adrian has devoted his life to working in mental health due to his own personal experiences of illness, and as well, sadly, as the loss of his own brother to suicide in 2015. Initially researching, speaking, and education on suicide prevention, Adrian's work now spans many aspects of mental health and social issues, and he's the founder and the director of his own company, the Mental Health Consultants. In addition to this, Adrian is also involved in many other projects in relation to creating social responsibility and collaborating with other creative agencies, broadcasters, and third sector organisations. So that's an introduction from myself to Adrian. I'm now going to pass to Adrian to, I suppose, build on that introduction and introduce the rest of the facilitation team for the morning. And I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you all are too. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. And good morning to everyone. It's always really nice to see how many people actually show up. So that is awesome. Just as a brief note from me, as we sort of go through the day, we've got various different things. We've got our wonderful speakers who are going to kick off the morning. We're going to have the opportunity for breakout rooms and a panel as well. The likelihood is that we're going to be discussing some subjects that may or may not be a little bit triggering, etc. Absolutely no one's going to be insulted if you want to go and have a cup of tea or even log out or anything like that. So absolutely no worries about that. As David said in my introduction, part of my work is as one of the founders of the Speakers Collective, and the Speakers Collective is a national group of campaigners, speakers, consultants, and all kinds of social issues up and down the UK. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce two other speakers from the collective who are going to kick off this morning, and they actually have an opportunity to give you sort of quite a somewhat longer personal story. So it doesn't need a huge amount of introduction from me, but we're going to kick off with Sunisha Winter, who is a diversity and inclusion consultant and also a founder of the Speakers Collective. And after that, we're going to hear from Denise, who is also a diversity inclusion consultant and the founder of her own charity, Reach Out to Kids. So first of all, you don't need to hear my voice anymore. Let's go with Sunisha.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's talk on Brave Conversations and a masterclass in diversity. And I think that's quite an intense title, and it sounds a bit intimidating to me, but my name is Sunisha Winter. My pronouns are she and her, and as Adrian introduced me, I am a diversity and inclusion consultant. And a key part of my work, I aim to further inclusion and advocate for marginalized people in the workplace or within communities. I've worked across all different sectors, including tech, the public sector, as well as with third sector organizations. And I really like to drive into the areas of vulnerability for people to share what they find difficult about inclusion or what topics they don't understand, and for me to provide an empowering space where we can learn and grow together. And so hopefully we can go on a bit of a 3-hour journey together today. I also aim to support others by sharing my lived experience of my mental health conditions and my recovery journey. I'm committed to raising the awareness of barriers to our mental health and access for diverse communities. I really love this work, and it means so much to me from a personal and professional level to be able to support organizations and communities to have these conversations of vulnerability, these brave conversations. I think it's really important to, when we ever do a personal story, to start at the beginning, because it helps everyone to follow on. And when I think about the fact that I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder 4 years ago, I was really shocked at first because I read the symptoms of my disorder and I reflected on how I behave. And it all started to really make sense of why I was diagnosed with this scary, serious mental illness. And a key symptom of borderline personality disorder is having a low sense of self. So I have a tendency to view things in extremes, and I have black and white thinking, so all good or all bad. And it can be really difficult for me to feel like I know myself, because all I feel like I know is my trauma, and my trauma is based on racism and biphobia. So those are your trigger warnings for today's talk that I'll be sharing. I was born in South London, and my mum had me when she was 17, and I was very much determined to impress my family as their oldest grandchild. It's very difficult in this country when you grow up feeling kind of like you don't belong. And on the screen, you can see I've mixed the Jamaican flag with the Union Jack, because that's my heritage. So my family, my grandparents are from Jamaica, and they came over with the Windrush generation in the 50s. And I have never been to Jamaica. I feel that the culture is informed maybe the way I speak to a degree, the way I enjoy food and music, and potentially has shaped some of my values as well, my traditional values. However, I feel so far removed from that culture because, as I said, I've never been there. But people don't see me as British or English, as I would potentially even go as far as to describe myself. They don't see me in that way. And so Afua Hirsch's book, British, when I read that title, it just summed up how I felt my whole life. When I was 8 years old, my mum was a victim of domestic violence. And so we moved into a refuge on the outskirts of London. And I went from being in central London, I was living in Brixton, which at the time in the 90s was also seen as Little Jamaica because it had a huge Jamaican population. And so I felt very much like I fit in there. I saw people that looked like me, talked like me, had similar parents or grandparents like me, and I felt like I fitted there. But when I moved into this refuge that was on the outskirts of London, I was the only Black girl in my class. And it was very difficult to get along with my peers around me because they started to make comments about my skin. They started to make comments about my hair, saying that it was too thick, that I looked like a toothbrush. There was so much bullying. And when I brought it up to a teacher, I was told, we don't see color. And that really pigeonholed my experience of whether I could trust those in power or with a level of authority to see my truth and to hear the trauma that I was sharing with them. And I couldn't really open up to my classmates anyway, because I was homeless. I wasn't living in a place where I could invite them over and have sleepovers or anything like that. And so I really started to withdraw within myself and mold my personality to, I wanted to fit in with my peers. And so I started to have this sort of identity crisis, and this only got worse in high school, because within high school, and there's a really, really awesome book that you should check out, it's called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And that book is based on American stories, but it's really useful in understanding the importance of having spaces to share collective experiences. And yes, not all Black kids are the same, but it was so important for me as a teen to find unity with people that understood my culture, and I didn't have to over-explain or educate others or be tolerated. I just wanted to fit. And this leads me on to the point of wanting to find myself. And so next slide, please. I grew up in a very working class background. I grew up on a council estate. I was a free school meal student. I was the first in my family to go to university. And I went to this all-girls high school, and a lot of the Black kids within the school tended to be treated unfairly. We were considered louder. There was not much representation, with prefects all being white, head girls all were white in the past. And then as I reached throughout high school, I really wanted to stand up and be a role model for others. And so I became deputy head girl within my high school. And it was a huge moment for me. I started to realize I found validation in achievements, which can be difficult. And I'll go into why seeking validation of your existence in your achievements, it can be helpful, but it can also be a huge hindrance to how you see your self-worth and your sense of self as a whole. I also was struggling with my sexuality at this stage, because I was a teenager starting to have all these hormones and feelings. And I was in high school from 2004 to 2009. So I'll let you do the maths on how old I am. But I started just after Section 28 ended in England in 2003. So Section 28, to give you a quick background, was a piece of legislation that was introduced in 1989, and it effectively banned conversations about same-sex relationships in school. And it really ushered in a dark era where bullying flourished, and young LGBT people like myself were left to suffer in silence. And the legislation also forced LGBT teachers into the closet or out of the job. So nobody, when I was growing up, was talking about same-sex relationships or what it was like to not have a heteronormative life that I felt was constantly thrust on me, that I have to be this way, I have to be married to a man, I have to do the things that my family expected from me. I'm also a Christian, and so juggling the feeling like I'm letting down God, because I knew that I was also attracted to other girls in my school. And why was I feeling like this? We weren't taught anything other than heterosexual relationships in sex education. There were no LGBT networks, and being gay was something we saw in magazines or on TV. It was also something that was not discussed at home. It was very much a taboo sort of experience, because my family being from Jamaica, and Jamaica is still suffering from the colonial overhang of certain laws that basically made homosexuality illegal. And so that has framed a lot of mindsets within the Jamaican culture of somebody's LGBT, they're living this westernized life, they're not in touch with their culture. And I witnessed one of my friends who was a Jamaican like me, or of Jamaican heritage like myself. And she tried to come out as a teenager, and she really, really struggled. And it really impacted me, because I witnessed her being thrown out, her family not accepting her. We used to go to parties and we'd hear homophobic language in reggae music, and it was just a part of our culture. And so I had a lot of internalized homophobia towards myself. I couldn't be gay, I couldn't be bi, it was wrong. And that's what I told myself for a lot of the time. And because I'd got used to molding who I was or how I came across to make others feel more comfortable, I realized that hiding my sexuality was obviously a lot easier than hiding my race. I couldn't hide that I was a Black woman, but I could hide that I was bisexual. And so I stayed in the closet. I really do like that people are starting to use the phrase, instead of coming out, it's saying letting people in. And I didn't start to let anyone in until I moved to university, and I decided to go to a uni a bit far from home. For me, it was the furthest I'd ever went, which was Portsmouth, because I hadn't left the UK. Like I said, I'm a working class person. I hadn't left the UK until I was in my early 20s. And so Portsmouth was the furthest I'd ever been from home. It was a whole different culture, a different environment. I really started to come into myself, and I wanted to let people in and let people see the real me, or the me that I wanted them to see, and not me molding for how I would want them to like me, or what I would assume they would like me because I was something. I tried to join the LGBT network at university, and on joining or walking up to the door to just start building new relationships with new uni students, I was told that the African Caribbean Society was meeting down the hall, and I'd gone to the wrong door. I was then, like, no, I know I'm supposed to be here. And over the time within that LGBT network, I heard many biphobic comments saying that bi people were greedy or confused. And so I felt like I couldn't be my whole self anywhere, because even this LGBT network wasn't welcoming of me, because they assume that I'm a Black woman, I shouldn't be in this space. I'm a bi woman, and well, you're not queer enough. And so I really struggled. And these are the cultural pressures that Black LGBT people face. They face potentially isolation from your family, your community, your church. They also have to deal with the narrative, that the idea that LGBT identities are a Western concept or corruption. And so you're dealing with so much collective shame, because you're wanting to be the best. I wanted to always achieve. And like I said, I'm the first to go to university. I was very proud to be the first Black deputy head girl within my high school. But I still felt a sense of shame, because I had this queer identity within me, and I wanted to hide it. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share with you a quote by Audre Lorde, and Audre Lorde was an amazing poet, as well as just a force for the LGBT community. And there's a quote that I think really sums up how I see myself and how we should see diversity and inclusion. And Audre Lorde said, "There is no thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives." And I think it's so important when we think about LGBT issues and Black issues, women issues, etc., to look at it from a point of intersectionality, and to recognize that the ways that oppression can impact us, it can combine and create a whole unique experience of oppression. And I think it's really important to touch on that and to mention that. I just want to say, because you can see on the screen, this is the happy moment for my life and my personal story, because I really started to accept myself once I let people in, when I came out of the closet, when I started to be my true self. And when we talk about inclusion, you always hear the phrases, people should be able to be their authentic selves at work. We talk about being honest, open, valid, and authentic. But for bi people, the stereotypes about your sexual orientation mean that by being yourself, people actually assume that you're inauthentic, that you're untrustworthy, and that you're naturally unfaithful. And so what does that do to your sense of self, your sense of my own identity, my sense of worth? Can I exist? Can I thrive in this environment, trying to survive in this world that tells me constantly that I shouldn't exist? And so when you're a bi person and when you're a Black bi person, it is very difficult. There can be an experience of denial. So people dismissing the existence of bi identities entirely. So talking about bi people as we're confused or we're not having made our mind up. And I remember my friends telling me that they thought I was a lesbian and I just needed time to figure that out, even though I had told them I'm bi. or when you attend Pride, and this is, there's a picture of me on the screen, I'm wearing a Stonewall, Some People Are Bi, Get Over It top. And this was really where I started to come into myself. I hadn't come out to all members of my family yet, just my mom. And that was a very difficult experience because she felt like she had let me down because I was bi. And we had to do a lot of unpicking to have those brave conversations, to talk about her confusion, her initial denial or potentially frustration at my difference, and then to get to a point of acceptance, to understand that this is just who I am and this is how I see myself, and she loves me regardless. And I think that was the huge turning point for me to really want to discover a bit more about myself and accept this bi person that I tried to hide so much. I didn't go into much detail, but I do want to bring it up in a bit about the microaggressions that we can all experience. But I think when you want to be an ally to bi people, it's so important to think about how you can be specifically supporting bi people. So if you don't have in your policies anything that mentions biphobic bullying, and you're only talking about homophobic bullying, then you're not really being there for bi people. If you're using gay as a shorthand for LGBT people, you are not being there for bi people. I want to share my microaggressions with you. And next slide, please. And I think it's really important for us to know how to define microaggressions, because we hear so many words in inclusion and that can sometimes fly over our heads of what does this even mean? And microaggressions are the everyday verbal, non-verbal and environmental slights or snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate a hostile, derogatory or negative message based on a person's marginalized identity. And that's a quote from Dr. Daryl Wing Su. Microaggressions help to create a system of inequity. And inequity is where we're not on the same playing field. We're not on a level playing field. Life isn't fair because there is an imbalance to how people are treated or how they feel they are treated in our workplaces or within our communities. And so I've got some of my microaggressions on the screen that I would like to share with you all, because it can be difficult if you don't have the same lived experience as myself to know what are the potential microaggressions that I may be facing. And so I've got your hair, can I touch it? Somebody said that to me. And the reason why we don't touch or even talk too much about Black women's hair when we change it, and it's not because we're a hypersensitive community that we play these cards or police the way people speak, but we have to also consider the history of racism within this country and within the global world. And we have to think about the impact of where Black people were either slaves or paraded around as zoo animals, etc. And so a Black person's hair is very, very important to them because of some of those reasons that I've given, the historical reasons, as well as the context of beauty products for Black people are twice as expensive. They're not as accessible. So I can't pop to Boots and find all the products that I need, even though I've been born and raised in this country and this is my country more than any other one. So it's really frustrating when the world lets you know that you can't fit here. And then if you Google unprofessional hairstyles, the first hairstyles you will see are hairstyles like mine, afros. And when I was younger, I was really, really frustrated at my hair, and I asked my mum to chemically straighten it. And it was, we call it a relaxer, because I wanted to look more professional. I wanted to look more closer to a European standard of having straight hair, because those were the girls that were seen as beautiful when I was growing up. Even though chemical relaxers at a very young age or continued use can cause all sorts of cancer, health issues, and I used to have so many chemical burns on my scalp. It was a horrible experience. And then at 25, I decided to shave off all my hair and to actually see what I didn't know as a grown woman, isn't it sad? I didn't know what my hair curl pattern was like. I didn't know that. That's how much of my identity had been taken from me as a child, and I was hiding myself from myself. because I didn't even know that. Another microaggression is this is the gay network, and I talked about using gay as a shorthand for LGBT people. It really is just insulting, because I'm not LGBT, I'm bi, and I have a very specific experience because I'm bi. So make sure you're talking, when you're talking about a person and not a group of people, don't use acronyms, and make sure you're talking about the specific identity they identify with. Somebody also said to me, your name is hard to pronounce, can I call you Sally? And this was on my first lecture at university, and it was a huge lecture hall, and they were doing a register, and it was so embarrassing because this lecturer said, just, can I call you Sally? And again, my experience, my identity was being erased by others to make them feel more comfortable, or to make it easier for them. Where are you from? Where are you from? No, where are you really from? If I say I'm from London, no, from Croydon. I mean, where are you really from? It's really frustrating. Like I said, I've never been to Jamaica, so I can't tell you what the culture is like there. I can't tell you, but I can tell you what it's like to be a Black South Londoner. I can tell you that. That's where I'm from. I don't see colour. I told you about how that created a sense of distrust for me with a teacher when she told me that. And I've heard that as a term of endearment sometimes, of, oh, I don't see your colour. I wouldn't care if you're pink, purple or green. And who's pink, purple or green? I didn't know we had aliens on this planet. And maybe we do. I don't know about Area 51, but I do know that when people say, oh, I don't care if you're pink, purple or green, it again dismisses my experience as a Black woman. See me as a Black woman and treat me as a Black woman. I want you to do that. I invite you to do that. You are intimidating. Racialized language that is sometimes used to stop Black women in particular to speak out, or when we challenge a system. So I'll give you a bit of a story here. When I first started working within the third sector, and I really wanted to work for an organization that aligned to my personal values, it was very important for me, more than the financial sort of rumination, but to actually feel I was giving back to something. And when you join an organization where you believe the values are inclusive, and then they're not, and then you call it out, or you have a conversation about it, and then people start to tiptoe around you or walk on eggshells, or completely deny your experience, or tell you how intimidating it is to have somebody who thinks about these topics. But how can I not think about my race? How can I not think about my identity at work? How can I not think about my past experiences? You can't leave your how many years you have, or your journey at the door. I wouldn't ask anyone to not talk about anything that impacts their life, because that's unnatural, and we don't build true connections. We don't foster a sense of belonging by doing that. A few more here. So your partner is a man. People always assume that because when you're bi, you suddenly become straight or gay, depending on whether you've got an opposite sex partner or a partner of the same sex. And so it's really frustrating. Again, if a bi person says they're bi, take that as gospel until they tell you something different. And then pick a side. People telling me to pick a side, whether that's who do you care about more, the LGBT community or the Black community or the mental health community? Well, I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black bi woman, I'm a Black bi woman with severe mental health problems. So I care about everything. And I want us to always look at things from an intersectional perspective, to really think about where incidences of discrimination or oppression can occur in our communities, because only then can we create change. Next slide, please. And so I think it's really, really important to, as I've said, I wanted to touch on my mental health, and I wanted to talk about the adjustments that I think should be put in place. And I've got a short, I've just taken a short snippet of a wellbeing action plan that I use from Mind, the charity Mind. And if you go on their website, you can download one and complete it for yourself. But I think it's a really important tool in helping me communicate the needs that I have. So I like to have reasonable adjustments at work. I need them to thrive. And I think it's so important for us to consider when we're talking about reasonable adjustments to make sure that they're person-centered or led by the individual that's brave enough to talk about the fact that they have this horrific, potentially horrific, serious mental illness. And so for me, borderline personality disorder is a very stigmatized illness. And so people have a lot of preconceptions around that. And I really like to challenge those stereotypes and narratives. Next slide, please. I want to give you a quote, and this, when we think about allyship, you know, some people sometimes wear like a t-shirt or they'll put on their email signatures or a lanyard to say I'm an ally. But it's really important to just remind yourselves that allyship is not an identity. It is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. And that's a quote from the Anti-Oppression Network. And I think it's really important to ground our knowledge in that allyship is an active and consistent practice of using our power and our privileges to achieve equity and inclusion. And we have to know that we all have privilege. Yes, we all do. I have privilege. I'm a university educated person, and so I can apply for certain jobs. I also have a privilege of I don't have a physical disability, and so I don't ever think about how I'm going to access a space. And so it's important for me to think about how I can go on a journey of allyship for others who face a different type of marginalization to myself. And so it's important for us to recognize that allyship is not true allyship if we're not prioritizing or advancing a marginalized person's needs. We have to do that, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to be better. So it's not about saving anyone. It's not about being horrible to yourself and being mean to yourself because you have an unearned advantage. But it's important to recognize, has my life been made harder because I am white? Has my life been made harder because I'm middle or upper class? Has my life been made harder because I don't have a physical disability? And how could I support others who don't have the same unearned advantages as myself? Next slide, please. And so I just want to list off before I close some really key top tips that I would just like to leave you with, some key takeaways on when you're thinking about approaching a brave conversation with others, or thinking about how you go on this allyship journey for yourself, to recognize that we all start in different places depending on what diversity issue we're talking about, depending on whether we have the lived experience of certain issues. And even if you have the lived experience of an issue, we are not a monolith, so we do not live the same type of lives. One Black woman's experience can be very different to another Black woman's experience. And so it's so important for us to think about what we can do to uplift others, to think about how we can support change for our workplaces. And so I really implore you all to challenge exclusive practice and to monitor the impact on different groups. If you're putting in place these different diversity initiatives, we hear all the time that organizations are just talking the talk when they're having these brave conversations, but how do you walk that talk, and what are you going to do to ensure that you can put certain things in place to create an environment that really supports and encourages groupthink and embeds methods for everyone's voices to be heard? How do you create a space where you have those open and accessible networks that ensures that nobody gets stopped at the door and says, are you sure you're supposed to be here? How do you create that sense of belonging and welcoming for everyone to take part in all different areas of your diversity initiatives? And so I really want you to just consider how you can challenge other biases, whether you're calling something in, calling something out. And when you're calling something out, it's really important to not do it over the marginalized person. So don't think you're coming in on a night and you're going to save the person who's being victimized, but really think, how can I be led by the person that's potentially been impacted? Or how do I speak to the communities that are marginalized and ensure that when I'm putting certain practices into place, I'm considering them from the inception and all the way throughout, and then following up with them to actually see, did this work have an impact? Did I create change? And so I will end with really just saying that the best thing to do is to really keep sharing best practice, to keep talking, to keep advancing these messages of having brave conversations, powerful conversations, being open. Next slide, please. I did a TED talk last summer for the University of Bristol, and I would invite you to check it out, where you can hear a bit more about my story, but also my message that vulnerability is your superpower, which I strongly believe, because I say once you know in yourself who you are, nobody can take that light inside of you. And I really do believe that for myself. Now I know myself, I know how I identify, I know how I see the different ways of my identity and how it impacts me and how I see myself and others. And by doing that self-awareness, by doing that self-work, I've got this sense of self-love that can't be taken away. And I love the fact that I'm Black. I love the fact that I'm bi. I love the fact that even though I don't love that I have mental health illnesses, I love that I can support others or provide a sense of safety for others within my community to share that they have mental health illnesses, and to really challenge that narrative that I'm a strong Black woman. I am a weak Black woman. I'm physically weak, but I want to be able to be fragile, and I want to be able to be vulnerable. And I believe that the only way to do that is by admitting the things that have been hard for us, or the things that have created that sense of uncertainty in our lives, and think about how we can move forward together. So thank you so much for listening. I'll hand back over to Adrian, and I'm looking forward to the discussions later on in this session. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Sunisha. And I just want to take a few seconds to acknowledge the emotional labor that it does take to share your personal story. So thank you so much for sharing a personal story with all of us. As ever, it was fantastic. I wrote down about 15 quotes that I wanted to say, this is the important thing that I'm going to be left with, but it turns out the important thing is the last half an hour. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Now I'm really, really excited to very quickly introduce our next speaker. So as I said, Denise has been working in EDI, especially anti-racism, for quite a while. She's the CEO of her own charity and an overall agent of change. So without further ado, Denise, please go ahead.
Thank you for that introduction, Adrian, and thank you for your kind words. I mean, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So, as Adrian has alluded to, my name is Denise Stevenson. I'm the founder and CEO of a charity called Reach Out to Kids, which I founded 10 years ago, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a bit. I'm not an expert in D&I. I am someone with lived experience, similar to Sunisha's actually, who through my experiences of and the impacts that race and racism has had on me has shaped what I've done really with my life and my career, and the way in which I live my life and the things in which I do. So I'm going to be, as Sunisha was, vulnerable with you. I hope this is a safe space, and I hope through the discussion you can be vulnerable with us as well, because we understand that issues around race and racism are very, very triggering and can be very difficult. So with that, can I have the next slide, please? And the next one. So as I've alluded to, I've already said I'm a founder of a charity and CEO. I'm also a public speaker. I speak intensively about race and racism from my own experience, my own lived experience. Prior to being a charity, or at least actually, no, I founded my charity whilst I was a lawyer. So I had a very long and difficult journey trying to qualify as a lawyer, and eventually made it as a partner in a law firm. And I no longer call myself a lawyer, even though my sister, who is also a lawyer, says once a lawyer, always a lawyer. So there you go, I'm claiming it. I'm a co-founder of a running crew and podcaster with my sisters, and also not self-entitled, but I was nominated as an agent for change a few years ago for the work that I've done in this space. Next slide, please. I'm just going to have a brief, we've only got half an hour, so I'm going to do a quick zip through, but there's a lot to get through, so I thought that it would be good to just lay out what I'm speaking on today. I'm going to share my story, obviously, and I'm going to also share tips on how we can have healthy conversations around race and racism, because I've done this a lot, and the things that I'm told by people in the room is I don't talk about race and I don't talk about racism with my family. And I find it very interesting, that comment, particularly in light of the last 2 years. So we're going to just explore that a little bit more. Then I've got a short Q&A for you, and then I've put any questions there, but obviously there'll be time for questions later on when we go into our breakout rooms, come back into the panel. So next slide, please. So whenever I do this slide or present this slide, I'm always pleased that I am not in a room with the rest of you, because I can hear the little giggles. But this is me on the left when I was about 5 or 6 years old. It's a really old picture, you can tell by the cracks and by my outfit. But this was me, my early years. Life was not easy, but my upbringing taught me a lot. Similar to Sunisha, I grew up in a council estate in Harlesden, Northwest London. For those of you that know London, Harlesden was known as, at one point, the gun capital of London. Very unfair. My upbringing within this council estate wasn't idyllic. We were very, very poor, but I learnt a lot. There was a lot of community, a lot of people looking out for one another. It was, to me, a sort of a golden era in my upbringing. My parents, similar to Sunisha, were both from Jamaica, and they came over after the Windrush. So they came over when they were quite young. My mom was 14 and my dad was 21. And they met with their extended family on both sides in the West Midlands, where my grandparents settled. And then, thankfully or not, my parents came down to London. I always tease my cousins about their Brummie accent. So those of you from Birmingham, please don't shoot me. That's just something that we used to tease them, to niggle them. So we were in a council estate. My parents coming from Jamaica, and racism as it was at the time meant that they couldn't progress. So they had to take the jobs that were given to them or that they could get. My mum was a factory worker. She used to work for McVitie's. My dad was a delivery driver. They instilled in their 4 children the ethic of good education and work. And even though we went to a normal comprehensive, and there were issues there around self-belief and, you know, not having confidence in yourself, really, my sister and I, we loved to read, we loved to escape. And whilst we lived in the council flat, I just spent years thinking, how can I get my family out of this place? So this is really a story about a girl who had a dream. At 14, which is me on the right, circled, cheesy grin, I decided that I wanted to become a lawyer. But as I'll share with you in a moment, there were loads of obstacles in my way to progressing to what I wanted to achieve. My next slide, please. So, the challenges of being Black, female, and working class. As I've shared, my dream was to become a lawyer. And I don't know if there's any 70s babies in the room who remembers these 2 shows, The Cosby Show and LA Law. So these 2 programs were really the catalyst for me to wanting to be a lawyer. The Cosby Show was the first time ever that I had seen an image of a progressive Black family on television. Up until then, in the 80s and the 70s, Black people were often portrayed, and brown people were often portrayed, as animals. They were the criminals on the television. You would never, ever see a Black professional person on television. You would never see any person of color, of worth on your television screens. That was the image projected in the media, in the newspapers. It was all very negative. You never heard any positive stories. So when The Cosby Show came out, I was blown away. I wanted to be the matriarch, Claire Huxtable. I wanted to be her. She was a lawyer. Her husband was a doctor. They had wonderful children. They had a wonderful house. I thought, I want that. I really want that. I want that for me, and I want that for my family. But I didn't quite understand the inner workings of law until I discovered LA law, and they really took me into the courtroom. And I wanted the big hair, I wanted the shoulder pads, I wanted the corner office suite, I wanted it all. But obstacles. I had my teachers telling me, Denise, you cannot possibly do law. It is too hard for you. You are not the right fit for it. You don't have the right background for it. They stayed shy of saying you are a Black girl and you won't achieve, but this was the subtext. And I know this because a lot of my friends and family, when they shared with their teachers what they wanted to do, and it was journalism, a fashion designer, whatever, they were told, no, you can't do that. That's not for you. And those are stories that have been perpetuated throughout my life. Funnily enough, amongst my white friends who I asked that question to, none of them, apart from if they're from a working class background, none of them were ever dissuaded from doing what they wanted to do. So I noted very early on in my life that there was a real disconnect there. There was a real problem. So my barriers to becoming a lawyer was being working class, female and Black, the lack of representation that I saw on television and in the newspapers, teachers' negative assumptions, and then the lack of belief in myself. I began to internalize all of those stigmatizations that I was seeing around me. But I was really stubborn. I'm a really stubborn person. And I thought, actually, if there's a will, there's a way. I'm going to find my way through. And it was through talking to my head teacher after the next event happened. And I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. And what happened for me was that we had a Black barrister come into our school. So I was still 14 at this stage. And a Black barrister walks into our school to give us a talk about how he succeeded as a barrister in the UK. And my mind was blown into many different directions. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Here was a Black person who looked like me in the UK, who had become a barrister. He had done what I wanted to achieve. Up until that point, because of what I'd seen on television, I thought I'd have to move to the States or to Canada. I wanted to go to Canada to become a lawyer because I didn't think it was possible for me to do that here. Imagine that. A young girl who wants to achieve this dream, who thought the only way in which she could do it was to leave the country that she was born in. I think it's terrible, really. And I'm sad to say that some of those perceptions are still evident today. It still happens, it still occurs where you speak to Black and brown children and they don't believe they can achieve because of the messaging that is given to them. So back to me. I listened to what Peter Herbert had to say at the time. He was the president of the Society of Black Lawyers. He then became a lawyer. He then became a High Court judge, and I understand that he's now retired. And as a result of Peter coming to my school, changed everything for me. I thought, my gosh, I can be a lawyer in the UK. I can do this. And years later, I wrote to him. I found him on LinkedIn and I wrote to him and thanked him for the impact he had on my life because he literally changed it. And he didn't realize what impact he had on me that day. He really didn't. He walked out of my school, thought job done, and he just didn't realize what he did. And he thanked me for that. After he came, I went to my head teacher and I said, this is what I wanted to do. My ed teacher was the only one that listened to me. Days later, he came back to me with an outstretched hand, and in it was a book called An Introduction to Law. And he said to me, Denise, if you're really serious about becoming a lawyer, I'll help you. Read this book, and if you're still serious about it, come back to me and I'll help you. And he did. He helped me to get into university. And I'll be forever grateful for him for that. He also helped my sister to get into Oxford. So he has some magic dust. But he believed in us where nobody else would. And that's an important thing. You've got to believe in those that are coming up behind you and really listen to them when they say, I want to achieve something. So I fast forward, I qualified as a lawyer in 1999 after a lot of difficult years. I had years of working within local authority, and private practice actually, where I was relentlessly bullied. In one organisation, public sector, I was shouted at almost on a daily basis by one woman who was the head of the planning legal team at the time. I was denied training contract after training contract because of the fact that people just didn't think that I was, I had the ability to do it. And this was at Westminster City Council, I can share that with you. And it was every time I tried to progress, my avenues were blocked. And there was no other reason that I could see, because I could see other people progressing, other than the color of my skin. Now, some people might think that that's just me overanalyzing things, but I can't put it down to anything else. And at the end of the day, despite the obstacles that were being put in my way, I achieved what I set out to do. I qualified as a lawyer in 1999, and I didn't look back. I left the firm that I was in at the time because of their bad treatment of me. And then I kind of went from strength to strength, although becoming a lawyer and becoming a partner at a central law firm in the city did not protect me from racism. Even when I got there, I had various incidences of microaggressions and overt racism. So I'll give you two examples. I was in a partners meeting, and someone very, very senior in the firm, we had a break, and he came up to me. At the time, I had long hair and I had my hair in extensions, and this goes to the point that Sunisha raises earlier about your hair as a Black person. This person tugged on my hair, so I had extensions in, so my hair was long. He tugged on my hair and he said, "What is this rope?" Rope. What an objectification. I was blazing mad, but I kept calm because I never wanted to be seen as that aggressive Black woman, that trope that is often lobbied at us. And I said to him, "Don't be silly. My hair is not rope, it's here." And I kind of laughed it off and walked away, but I didn't complain. I didn't tell a single other person in the room, and my firm did not know about that event until I was doing some training on race and racism for them a few months ago, and I shared that with them. Another incident was when we were training at the time commissioners of what was then the Infrastructure Planning Commission. Huge job for us. This was a new organisation set up at government level, sub-government level, to determine major infrastructure planning applications at the time. So we were training the first set of commissioners that were appointed to that body, and I was there with my colleagues, and a white lady. We were hosting, so I was serving teas and coffees before we started, and a white lady walked up to me, one of the commissioners, and she looked me up and down. I was suited in heels, perfect part. And she said, "Oh, I was thinking about the fact that you might have been the tea lady, but I thought maybe not. So I thought I'd ask you." And I looked around at me, at my other colleagues who weren't being asked this question. And she really thought I was the tea lady. And I said to her, "No, sorry, I'm not the tea lady here today. I am one of the partners at this law firm, and I'm actually training you this morning." And just in case I thought that there was any mistake about her intentions, or that, maybe she just made a genuine mistake, she blushed, she went bright red and started stumbling over her words and said, "Oh, no, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought I'd ask." And I just thought, why would you say that? Why would you say that to someone? So those are the kinds of things, and, going into planning inquiries and being considered as the paralegal or the legal assistant rather than the senior lawyer or the partner leading this multi-million-pound deal for the client. Those were often my experiences. And from that, I just looked around and I thought about my experiences once I became a partner. And I thought, you know, I don't want any young child to have to go through this. You know, I don't want them to go into places of work without having the tools to succeed, without having the language and the ability to counter the racism that they're going to face in the workplace. Next slide, please. And so where has my desire to make change in terms of race and inclusion taken me? As I said, when I got made partner in 2009 after 3.5 years at the law firm. So that for me was really kind of self-affirming. It meant that the hard work, everything that I'd been through was finally being recognized, but it wasn't enough for me. That was something, my appointment as a partner, I saw it as something not just to give me more money or kudos, I was meant to make a difference with that role. And so I decided then to start my charity, Reach Out to Kids, in 2011. And we take Black and brown professionals into schools to speak to young children, as I was as a 14-year-old, about their career aspirations and to pass on the tools that we've learned, pass on the experiences and skills that we've learned to help them succeed in whatever it is that they want to do. And it's also about social mobility, because we do in this country have a real issue with race and class. And I'm not going to say that one has prominence over another. I've had people come up to me and say, quite frankly, social mobility is the most important thing. It's more important than racism because plus, plus, plus. And I counter that by saying, you can progress from a working class background to a middle and upper middle class background. And there are going to be struggles along the way in doing that, culture changes and everything that you have to go through. But as a Black woman, I can't shelve off my Blackness, and I don't want to. I can't take off this skin color, and I don't want to. But those are going to be additional barriers that I have to face. But what I do also is I go into corporates and companies and I teach them about race and racism so that they can then recognize the patterns of behavior that they're doing in not protecting and securing and ensuring for their Black and brown colleagues and their white colleagues that they are able to communicate and have a safe space for all to thrive. And so we've taken corporates on the journey with us. And I've got a number on the back of George Floyd and the BLM movements of 2 years ago. We've had a number of companies come to us and say, how can we change? We've looked around and we've realized that we're too white. How can we make a difference? So that's what I do with ROC. I also started my own running crew 2 years ago with my sister, who's with me in that picture. Oops, sorry, could you just jump back one? Jump back 2, please. Thank you. Started a running crew with my sister and a close friend of ours, which encourages Black and brown people to move, and actually talking to organisations like Sport England and England Athletics about the lack of diversity in grassroots running that needs to change, and also media publications about that as well. And I also started my own podcast with my sisters called the Start Line Podcast. And it is around changing the narrative. It's around saying to media publications, we will tell our own positive stories. We will tell stories from our perspective and share them with people, because there are things that Black and brown people are doing that are positive that needs to be shared and championed. And just illuminate for people our lived experience. So those are the things that I have done. The questions that I have for you is, what can you do as well in your own little spheres? So next slide, please. So I'm going to come off my story and I'm going to try and bring it into the conversation that we're having today, which is how to have brave conversations around diversity and inclusion. And as I say, I specialize in race and racism. So that's what my talk focuses on. So questions that I touch upon: how would you define racism, and to what extent does race impact on your lives? Now, this might be an easy question for Black and brown people to answer, but for white people, it's a little bit more challenging for them. How would you approach asking questions around a person's culture, experiences, background, if they are different to yours? And how to ensure that you use the right terminology, language when discussing racism? Next slide, please. Firstly, learn the basics. Defining racism is difficult. It is complicated. And it is important to say that actually we tend, especially in this country, to think about racism being, you know, the national front type racism, you know, where one person says a really nasty, horrible thing to another person, or they harm them in some way, shape or form. And that's not it. You know, that's the tip of the iceberg. We then have the other side of it, which is the racism that is embedded in our society, the structural and systemic racism that we actually all live in. It's the air that we breathe. And that's not to say that we all should walk around with we've got a racism problem chip on our shoulder in the UK, but just being aware that there is a subtext to our society. That means racism is there in health, in education, in employment, in housing. COVID has drawn this out in stark reality, and we've got to be alive to it. And we've got to think, well, how can we change this? So I'm not going to go through all of the points here because we don't have time, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that there are entrenched forms of racism, and we've got to really overcome it. So as an organization, we need to look at our policies and practices. We've got to think about when our employees complain to us about race and racism, about an experience that they have, how much are we listening to them? Or are we just closing our ears off to it because it's too difficult to deal with? Next slide, please. A question for you to reflect on. What impact does race and racism have on my life or your life? And why is this important? It's funny, I was at a conference, I was at the National Running Show in Birmingham at the weekend with my running crew. And my running crew is called Emancipated Run Crew. And we had a lot of white people coming to us and saying, emancipation, what does that mean? And you had to just start with the basics and think, well, what does emancipation mean to you? What does race and racism mean to you? And we had a few white people come to us and say, it's really funny because we don't talk about these things, and it's important that we do. And other white people saying, actually, I am having conversations now with my family members because I think it's important. Now, in asking this question and posing this question, I don't have all the answers because I don't know you, I don't know your experiences. But I think in asking yourself these questions and reflecting on them and answering them, really answering them for yourself, I think you will learn more about yourself. So if you do nothing but take a screen grab of this and come back to it later on, and maybe discuss it with your children, discuss it with your partners, and ask them, well, what does race and racism, what does that mean to you and why is it important to you? Then I think we can start becoming more comfortable about discussing these issues with our peers. Can I have the next slide, please? So how do you have conversations with race and racism within your organizations and teams? I've put this in full here because there's a lot to cover, but I think we can do certain things which are important. If you're leaders within your organization, please lead by example. Create a space where people can have these brave conversations. If you're brave enough to have these conversations in a healthy way with your colleagues and your employees, others will do so too. And in order for you to do that, you have to create a safe space where people can share how they're feeling without judgment or repercussion. Within law, I'm hearing a lot about people being sort of victimized because they have shared a racist experience that they've been through, and that's not right. And if we can't that, if we can't get that right within the employment sphere, how are we going to be able to resolve it in society? Be curious, but not ignorant. We've lived together in this multicultural place that we call the UK for a number of centuries, not just years, century. You know, Black and brown people didn't just come here with the Windrush and, you know, with immigration in the 60s and 70s. We were here long before that. So if we have questions, be curious but not ignorant. And allow people to share their experiences without trying to rationalize or explain away what they went through. When people go through certain experiences, for example, picking up a really difficult issue like George Floyd, people were quick to say, well, what did he do? You know, he shouldn't have been in the shop doing whatever he was doing. Did that ever justify him being murdered? No, it didn't. So we have to be careful when we try and rationalize or explain away the experiences of Black and brown people. Thank you. I was going to ask for the next slide. How do we ensure that we use the right language or terminology? Well, I think I don't have the answer to this, but I have to say that we are all learning. The last 2 years has seen a real shift, a real change, where people are beginning to listen. Before 2 years ago, I wouldn't be having this frank discussion with you about race and racism. I wouldn't have been sharing my background. That was something that was personal to me and not something that I wanted to share, not even with my peers. But now it's the whole shift with the last 2 years. They have given us the opportunity to open up things and start talking. And there is no right or wrong, provided we frame our words with respect and consideration for others. And key terminology, which shouldn't be used, that's an important one. There's key terminology that should not be used, i.e. the use of the word coloured. And I had to pick up 2 young women over the weekend, this weekend just gone, who had used the word coloured. And I said to them, please do not use that word. That's really offensive to people of colour. And they were ashamed and surprised that it had come out of their mouth. I would ask you to, if you haven't already, please read and share resources that I've put down there, including White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, How to Be an Anti-Racist, The Good Ally by Nova Reid, and White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is an essay that was written, I think in the 1990s, but really, really important in understanding white privilege and what it means, because again, that word is quite triggering. Next slide, please. So I would ask you to take a screen grab. We can come back to this later on, actually, so that you have the time to actually look at these questions and really consider them within your organizations. I've shared these slides before, this one and the next one, and it's been used as a kind of a foundational piece for organizations to start talking about race and racism and improving diversity and inclusion within their own organizations. So if you can take a screen grab of that very quickly and of the next slide, I would ask you to do a piece of homework and just go away and consider these questions, get together with people in your senior positions and ask yourself these frank questions, and then share your learnings with your members of staff and use it as an opportunity to start having those difficult discussions in the workplace. Next slide, please. And I would also ask you to take a screen grab of this. I'm a minute over on this talk, but what I would say is before we start having conversations, we need to do the work ourselves. We need to do the internal work, and then we need to do the external work. So please don't be silent. Don't allow racism to thrive in silence. You have to educate yourself. Use some of the references that I've shared with you. Be honest and open and constructive when having your discussions, and then be receptive. People will share difficult things and difficult experiences, and you just have to sit in that uncomfortableness and undertake self-examination. Really examine what you really think and all those unconscious biases that you might have, all those issues. I have them myself. You know, we have to be alive to the fact and really be honest with ourselves when we're undertaking this work, and then act. Don't just talk, take action. And I've listed things there that you can do. Next slide, please. Why do we do this? Well, we do this in order to ensure that we have a happy, diverse and inclusive environment. And really, this is proven to be true in various researches. Having improved diverse and inclusive environments leads to less turnover of staff, leads to a happy and inclusive business. It brings a different approach, thinking outside the box and against the norm. It enables you to be a true agent of change, a beacon of light for other businesses. And it means that you make a difference. Next slide, please. And I just leave you with this wonderful quote that I absolutely love. And it reinforces what I've just shared there. And it's by Verna Myers. And she says, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And belonging is dancing like no one is watching. Thank you very much for hearing me. And thank you for allowing me to go over by 3 minutes. I'm really sorry. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion later on.
Denise, thank you so much for the last half an hour. That was incredibly powerful and incredibly important as well. Just like with Sunisha, I do appreciate that sharing your own story comes with a lot of emotional labor. So I really, really want to take a couple of seconds to thank you for that. Some really powerful messages in there. I think, one thing that I have taken from the last half an hour, as well as from many sort of other occasions, is that there are really tough conversations to have. There is difficult work to do, and it is uncomfortable, but it is absolutely necessary. And I would thank you so much to both of you for sharing stories, etc. The really powerful message that I take from both of our speakers is that it is not their job to make us anti-racists. It is our job and your job sort of as a collaborative to do so within your workplaces. So thank you for those practical steps and all of those materials, Denise. I believe that now Manara is going to take us into breakout rooms, and everyone is going to have some questions broadcast to them, so that we can all sort of have some discussions and reflect on the last hour of amazing information that we've received. So I guess that is the next step. Cool, it looks like everyone is back in the main room, so that is fantastic. I hope that you had really productive breakout sessions. I think there's a lot to discuss and a lot to think about with this session. So I hope that was productive. We've come to the section where we've got the opportunity for all of you to ask our panelists some questions, and I'm going to do my best to moderate that and make sure as many questions are asked as possible. So if you would like to use the chat function to put in any questions that you thought of as a group, as well as any questions that you have as individuals. One thing that I would say is there is absolutely no such thing as a stupid question, but there can be such thing as an insulting question or a badly considered question. So do have a little think before typing in the questions, but otherwise we should be pretty much good to go. Just to make sure, do we have Sunisha and Denise back from our break?
Yep, I'm here.
Excellent. And Sunisha's here as well, camera on. Wonderful. So we've got a first question that has come through from those groups that I'm just going to put to both of you and see who wants to answer it first, which is around how do you approach making the leadership teams from all of the organizations represented here today more diverse? So a nice open one. Who would like to take that?
I can start, and then Denise, if you have anything additionally else to add,
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Happy.
So how to diversify your leadership teams? I think it's an important question, and it's something we should all be considering within our organizations or within communities. But I think what's key is to ask the question of, when you're talking about improving the diversity, who are you talking about? Sorry, there is a bit of background noise, and if you can stay on mute, because I have concentration issues, so it's a bit difficult for me to focus. But one of the key things is really for for leaders to ask that question of, when I say diverse, who am I talking about? And if you are talking about increasing ethnic diversity, you need to say that. And same with gender diversity, etc. So really being clear on, okay, we need more representation in this specific area for these demographics. But then representation isn't everything for an organization. And so if you are welcoming or wanting to diversify your leadership team, what power are you going to give the individuals that you are hiring? How are you going to ensure that not only do you hire someone who is of a different background or more diverse background to the current employees that you have on your leadership team, but what are you going to do to ensure that what they say has weight, that they are able to inform decisions and they are able to lead the conversation in areas that they need to? And so I think, yes, representation is important, and increasing diversity matters so much by having a diverse recruitment panel, calling it out on the tin when you're having an application, saying we are underrepresented by Black employees at a leadership level. So really being clear with your language and being specific on who you're looking for. But then when they join the organization, thinking about, are they going to have to navigate policies that aren't robust enough? Are they going to have to navigate conversations around the water cooler that happen and people just don't challenge that? So really think, am I going to essentially create more harm by increasing diversity? And are we ready to welcome a new Black leader into our team, if we're being that specific? And that's what I would think about. Any thoughts from your side, Denise?
Yeah, no, just to build on that, I think that people need to consider their why. So increasing diversity, and Shanice is right, apologies, I've got a next door neighbour who's having an extension done to their house, so there's lots of drilling going on, so if you hear background noise, that's on this side, apologies. So consider the why, and this is important because organisations must shy away from, you know, this tick box exercise, so not taking on Black and brown people or more people from the LGBTQ communities or less able bodies, just to make themselves look good or make the organisation look good, or to say, yeah, we've done this piece of work now, we're good. So you've got to have an understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, and also take your team, take your staff members, take your organisation on that journey with you, so that they understand what's being done, so that if you do bring on a person of colour, say within the leadership team, it's not seen as tokenism, that they understand the why, and that actually you make it clear that, yes, we might have a focus on this, but we still have appointed the best person for the team for that job. The other thing to help you to understand is to ensure that there is, yes, a piece about recruitment of diverse communities, but retention of those diverse communities are also very important. So, you know, you might hit the numbers, but if your culture doesn't accept them and is not welcoming, they're not going to stay. And, you know, and that creates an unhealthy environment for everyone. So I think, you know, it goes back to that internal piece, doing that internal work, fixing the internal and understanding why you're doing what you're doing and what needs to be fixed, and then dealing with the external.
That's great. And I think, yeah, both of you raised really, really important points on, you know, it's absolutely not a sort of one issue, one fix conversation within there. The second question that we've got through is something that I think that we can talk about for a very, very long time, but I think is really, really important. How do you call out racism in the moment where you've experienced it, or where you've seen someone experience it? Should we go back to Sunisha quickly on that one?
How do you call out racism if you witness or experience it? Well, if you're the person experiencing racism, it's up to you whether you choose to call it out. You have to be prepared potentially that you may be pushed out. You might be seen as playing the race card, that special word that people like to say, or you might find it a bit difficult to navigate in your working environment once you do call it out as a marginalized person. So that's where allies, we look at you to put yourself on the in the frying pan. And I do see like not avoiding the conversation of racism, or if you are calling something out, to be led by that marginalized person that you're planning to support, or you notice that they had witnessed or experienced a microaggression. What are you going to do for them? And instead of saying, oh, I'm going to tell this person off in front of the whole team and call it out and say that was a microaggression, and I know because I went to this course, etc. And this could have hurt, this comment that you said could have hurt Sunisha, and it puts everyone to look at me, and then I feel like I'm the problem, even though I'm the person that was victimized. So really speaking to the marginalized person and finding out, what would you like me to do? Would you like me to do anything? And sometimes some of us say, you know, I've dealt with this my whole life, I don't want to deal with it in my workplace today, or I don't want my team to think that I'm a troublemaker, because we've experienced racism throughout different courses of our life, and so we don't want to cause trouble. And so when you are wanting to be an ally in that situation, to not put the words out and be labeling people of you're racist, you're this, because people will just shut down, but really talking about the event and how it made you feel. And yes, even though this person of color might think, you know what, this isn't even my issue, I don't even care about this, like I don't care what people say within this workplace, but you've got to establish a culture that you want to lead with internally. So you can't always expect for, oh, because Sunisha didn't raise it, it's not an issue. It still could be an issue. So make sure you have that conversation and think about a way of doing it that doesn't step on that marginalized person or step over them. But it's so important to not do anything. And by not doing anything, you're being complicit in racism. And that's the biggest takeaway for you all.
I think that's a perfect point. You know, I think that it is difficult, but actually as I said before, we can't allow these things, we can't allow racism to thrive in silence. So, you know, I say where you would see it, if in your personal environment, say you're on a train traveling into work or whatever, and you see an incident, would you call it out? And a lot of people might say no, because I'm protecting, you know, I don't know what will happen to me if I got involved in that situation. But that's that, you know, and I understand that self-protective viewpoint, but actually that enables the thing to just continue, and no one gets, you know, there's no action, there's no accountability, there's no, you know, fallback on for those perpetrating the act. So I think it's important for us to just consider, reflect on our actions, and really be clear within the work environment of what the steps will be. To Shanice's point about asking the marginalized person, I mean, that in itself is difficult, but it's important, because one person might think, well, actually, I don't want any fuss. I don't. And another person will think, actually, I want the organization to do something about this. You know, I want you to do something about it. And even sometimes when you say, I don't want anything to happen, you really do, because you want people to see and to hear from your experiences. So it's very, very difficult. But I think bringing that person into the conversation and making them feel safe and making them feel reassured that there's no repercussions on their job or position, they will not then be victimized, and just hearing what they have to say and then taking action from as a result of what they said.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's really important. I think also one thing that I would add, and obviously I do not have the experience of racism, but I do have the experience of marginalization from the perspective of the LGBTQIA community. When we're talking about calling people out and thinking about your own safety, I would never ever advocate for, you know, anyone to purposefully put themselves in a violent situation or anything like that. However, what I would say is no matter what is going to happen, you are still not the victim of that situation, or you are not the primary victim of that situation. So you do need to sort of think about it. As Denise said, when there is discrimination going on, allowing it to thrive in silence is just not an option. And obviously you don't necessarily need to go in all fists blazing, but that's really, really good. We've got another question coming up, which I think is actually quite interesting, because especially you, Denise, you've provided a lot of really good practical steps and practical advice about what organizations can do. The question here is, A, do the panelists think that any progress is being made or has been made? And if so, what are the positive steps that you've already seen that have been taken?
Interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly on the back of, so we celebrated 10 years of my charity last year, and it made me stop and reflect, well, have things really changed? Are things getting better? Are we really improving the lives of young people from Black and brown communities, or from lower social economic backgrounds? And also the last 2 years have given me pause for thought, as it has everybody really, when things blew up after George Floyd. Are things improving? I'm not sure, to be honest. I've seen some improvement, but in the last 2 years, with the conversation, in parallel, there's been a real backlash. There's been a real culture war. There's been a real reinforcement of certain messages coming out from the government, so coming out from the top of the higher echelons of this country, and everything that is happening in the States, with the removal of the statutes and the emotive things that brings, the conversations around slavery and the fact that people want us to close that down because goodness knows it happened such a long time ago. I think there is a certain backlash going on, and I think that backlash is happening because systems are under threat. Certain power structures are under threat. The way in which we live our lives, or the way in which we have perceived things, are under threat. And so there is this kind of, I'm not accepting this, what you're saying is lies, and it's very divisive. And so we do have to be careful as we move through this new space where we're talking about racism, that we don't alienate people, and we don't give ear and truth to people's experiences. So there is that balancing act. The positive things that I've seen come out in the last 10 years from my own personal experience is that I've been able to have a voice and to hear my voice and be brave enough to speak from a personal perspective. From my charity's perspective, it is also that companies are more open about having this discussion with me. They will approach me and say, Denise, we know we're too white. We want to change this. How can we do it? How can we work with you? And I think that's a real positive. And also that young people aren't afraid of speaking their truth. They are more vocal than we were, easily. And I think we should champion that and have them hear their voice. Now, sometimes you get very different views and everybody's in conflict, but actually if we stop and really hear and listen and understand, then I think we can move forward on some of these things and really bring a positive change to it.
That's great. And I think, while all of the sort of necessary steps, etc., that should have been taken a long time ago haven't been taken, that sort of want for change, etc., I think is really, really important, and is the reason why we're on this call, right? So that is definitely something to take back. We have so many questions coming through, so I'm going to speed along because I do want as many answered as possible, but I do have one that I'm very interested in Sunisha's answer to, which is, as language around race, ethnicity, and sexuality evolves, how can we ensure we stay up to date and use respectful language, especially if we live in a local community that doesn't necessarily have representatives of people within those communities? And I know you like this discussion, Sunisha.
I love this question. This is a great question because language is always changing. And the answer really is you have to keep learning. Honestly, there's no chapter that's going to close. Some members of the, well, if you're using BME and if you're using it in legal terms or within policies, some members of the people that you would expect to identify and that hate the term and don't use the term for themselves. I, as an individual, would never describe myself as a BAME individual. I'm a Black woman and I center my Blackness in that sense. And so language is constantly changing. The way we see language, the way we use language, that's why that I don't see color thing doesn't run anymore, because 20 years ago, it was the narrative to be colorblind. And so we have to be willing to keep hearing different conversations about how language is evolving around race and keep wanting to have the conversation. Intersectionality is a term that's been around for decades now and is only now being talked about in workplaces and at a level of everyday language. And that's why I think, to go back to the previous question, we aren't where we need to be. And yes, it's great to look at the positives of, okay, we have similar employment laws and experiences that should protect us, but we aren't all protected. And we have to acknowledge that we can't erase centuries of racism in a few short decades of law changes. And so we have to be willing to keep up to date with language. We have to speak to members of the community who identify in certain ways to be led by the language they're using, and to know that it's not your place to use every word as well. So obviously there are certain words that some community members use and you should know what they are. I'm not going to say them. If you're not LGBT plus or LGBTQ plus, you shouldn't be using the word queer. And that term can also be quite offensive for the older LGBT community as well. So it's really important to think about the language you're using, who you're talking to. If you're talking to a young person, young people might start using the term people of color more. However, a lot of young people also find that term offensive, as it's another grouping term for us all. And so speak to the individual, find out what the individual wants you to use when you're talking about their ethnicity, if it's relevant to the conversation, of course, but not just to go up to a Black person and be like, how do I describe you today? But to keep reading, to keep listening and to keep learning, I think is the big thing, because in 20 years, we might not use people of color. It might be completely outdated, just like BAME is now. So be willing to move with the times. That's my thing. And yes, we do have to be led by the younger generation.
That's brilliant, Sunisha. Thank you so much. And I think it does hark back to points that both Sunisha and Denise made in their introductory talks, doesn't it? In terms of it is your work to do, and that it's that's pretty much the be all and end all of it. One thing that I would say is Googling the phrase like sensitive language guide takes about 1.5 seconds. So many organizations have published PDFs, etc., on what the current language is to use in a lot of different circumstances. So 5 seconds of your day is an educational piece and not too much work. I've got another language related question that I would like to ask you, Denise. I'm sorry that we're going so quickly, but people are enthusiastic here. It's around the word tolerant. So we quite often use the word tolerant in the UK as, the UK is a tolerant country, etc. But to tolerate something sort of means to put up with it. So what's your view on the use of that word?
Don't like it.
Very specifically.
Yeah, don't like it. Don't like it. I mean, am I a person that should be tolerated? I looked at that question myself and I thought it was really, really interesting. So to just expand, it says we regularly hear people in the media talk about UK, GB being a very tolerant country and tolerating people from different races of religious background. Now that seems to place white people as a tolerating sector, and that people of different races being grouped into this other subsect. I think we should just get rid of the comment altogether. We are here in the UK and have been living in the UK for, as I said, centuries. And it's not about tolerating, it's about why not respecting? Why not celebrating? Why not? I don't want to use the word supporting, but some groups do need support, active support. There are different positive ways of saying it. And why not we just say the UK as a whole, and I know that there are pockets, but it's a multicultural, multi-diverse country. You know, we all have our parts to play, and different people have different experiences. But I think it's that lumping, it's that homogeneity that actually it doesn't work, because people on the one hand don't like it, and on the other hand they don't understand it. So I think we should get rid of it, because it is painful. It's a nuisance.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, it's the question of language is so important, but it's also, you don't necessarily need to go out and ask marginalized groups, is this word okay? I think with something like tolerate, the person who asked that question essentially answered it themselves as well. And it's very easy to speak without thinking, but it's also quite easy to take 1 or 2 seconds before a sentence comes out your mouth to think, could that potentially be offensive to someone? And if it could, just it's easy to change.
Yeah.
So thank you, Denise. So if we go back to Sunisha, I'm not asking these questions in order, it's all gone random on my screen. But you've both talked about championing young people, and Sunisha especially said, you know, those are the people who we need to listen to. So in the context of championing young people to be outspoken, how do you do that if you're not in a position of power?
How do you do that if you're not in a position of power? Is really, if you're not in a position of power, finding somebody who has a relative amount of power, who can influence decision makers, or can definitely provide a space or a platform for others, and lobbying for them to platform those young people or hear from those young people. I'm a huge believer in youth participation and co-creation when we're thinking about programs and resources and activities and services. You can't know if it serves the community if it isn't led by, or driven by, or invested in, or supported or acknowledged by that community. And so for young people who are very much wanting to have conversations on social issues, how are you going to invite them into the conversation to not only contribute, but to lead sustainable, long-lasting change? And what does that look like? And how can you do that in a way that isn't, I'm taking from one community for what I want, but how is it a shared sort of collaboration, so that community, the young people within that community, are also feeling like they're getting something out of it? But I definitely think to find the people with power is really about just approaching people and letting people know there's a gap here. We haven't invited young people in this sphere. We haven't heard from any young voices when we've been putting together this program of work. When we talk about young people, who are we actually talking about? Is it up to 25, or are we talking about under 16s, or are we talking about under 30? Do I still fit under a young person? I don't know. But it's important for us to know exactly who we're talking about and what voices we're trying to bring into different rooms. So I think, again, the core thing to consider when you are trying to do any sort of co-creation, co-collaboration with any sort of community is, what is the outcome? And what do I need to do? What are the equitable practices I need to put in place to assure we can all achieve that outcome at the same space?
Awesome, that's great. One thing that I would also say in terms of championing young people, or even sort of hearing from more young people, is that there's a very, very simple fact that they are all already speaking, and social media is very accessible. So you can elevate their voices, and you can literally just listen to their voices. They are all there, they are very loud, and they speak on these kind of issues a lot. So again, that's part of the work that we can all do, in terms of just making sure that we listen to the voices that are already speaking, rather than asking people who aren't speaking to put that emotional labor in. We have another question, which is around, do you know of any mental health organizations that work with people for race-based bullying and symbolic violence? And I get that could go to either of you in terms of organizations. I know that Denise, this is an opportunity to talk about ROC, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Although I think that we're not a mental health organisation, so in terms of that element, maybe Sunisha has some suggestions. And also, we don't really deal with race-based bullying or symbolic violence as such. What we do is help young people in their career aspirations. So and in doing that, demonstrating to them that, you know, there is power in who they are and what they are and what they want to be, and that they should never be told no. You know, they should never be told, you know, if they have a dream, no, you can't do that. Let's help them. Let's give them the tools to do it. If they're absolutely not capable, as in, you know, you've got a person who does not like science but wants to become a brain surgeon, you know, obviously we've got to be rational with this. But I think that also the work that we do in talking to corporates, and, you know, I do a lot of public speaking to those corporates about the harm that racism has, and I do touch upon, you know, the mental health impacts that it has, is helpful, I think. Sunisha, do you know of any mental health organisations?
Yeah, so Black Thrive is a really great organisation that work. Black Thrive, they work with mental health community services that are trying to speak more to the Black community and to ensure that we thrive when we are accessing mental health services. So a great place to start. And smaller community mental health teams sometimes do have people of colour groups or network groups within there, and Mind has their race equity advisory board as well. But it's really just reaching out to a small organisation depending on where you are based, and really being localised with your approach as well. Sometimes taking a London-centric approach isn't applicable for if you're in Somerset or Manchester, for example. So find out the local community groups or mental health services that are targeting programmes for Black people or people of colour in general, and think about how you can collaborate or support their movement there as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. I guess a similar follow-up question to that would be, in the context of involving people from marginalized communities, are there any methods, resources, networks that you can recommend and that could sort of help the organizations out in doing so? And especially, it says, in a way that works for them rather than an expectation that any community should conform to our norm. I think that's really important. So in terms of, well, first of all, any resources, networks, etc., that you could recommend to help out with that, with the involving marginalized communities, that can go to either of you.
There's so many networks, that's the thing, there are so many, and what we don't want them to do is become talking shops. So, you know, where people are just meeting and then complaining and not actually lending each other any sort of sponsorship or driving true change outside of, oh, I had a really great conversation around my identity. Sometimes that's useful, but sometimes it's not as useful for different communities. So when you are approaching different advisory groups, whichever they are, obviously I'm based in London, so there's the London Bi network there. There are all different LGBT community hubs within London as well. Depending on where you're based, it might be different. And I'm part of different Black advisory networks for mental health as well. But there are so many different networks. I think the core thing, instead of thinking about where are they, is what are we going to do when we approach them, and how are we going to collaborate in a way that's supportive for both of our communities or all communities, instead of how can we open this door for this hard to reach community when they're right there. So think about what you actually are wanting them to get involved with, and why you're doing this work, and how you're going to ensure their participation all the way through.
That's great. Thank you, Sunisha. Great. I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately, as much as I would love to go through all of the other questions within there and continue the session, I think nobody wants to be on Zoom for more than 3 hours. So we are going to have to start to close up. And one of the things that I've noticed, especially on this panel section where you've all asked some really good questions, everyone has been asking questions on practical methods to actually go forwards. And actually, you know, how do we put in systemic change, which I think is really positive to look at, and really shows what is driving the thoughts behind this seminar and actually the whole collaborative. So thank you very much for that. What I'm going to ask now is, with especially having seen some of the questions that have come through and having sort of been here all morning, if Denise, if we could ask you first, if you just have any sort of key thing that you would like everyone to take away from this, and some kind of a sort of closing thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I'm seeing this morning and through the questions that have come through, this is obviously a very, very difficult topic to cover, and it's we've been at it for 3 hours and we still haven't touched the surface, right? There's still a lot more to explore. But I think that language and learning, continued learning, is very important. And someone in this chat put this comment, and I noted it down because I thought it was brilliant. Keep reading, keep going to training, keep talking. And I would say also take action and ensure you remain accountable. So even though in the chat we've had a lot of questions and we've had a lot of, you know, really positive comments about how powerful the session was, what would be interesting, and I think it's probably due for another session, is for us to come back and find out what you've done. So you've learned from Sunisha and myself, and you've heard our experiences, and you've had a little bit of an insight into, you know, what people who are of our backgrounds go through. And what our communities, and I hate that word, communities, go through. But as an organization, my interest is, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to become the agents of change in your own organizations? And that will mean taking this away and going away and saying, okay, we have this information now, we're going to learn some more, and we're going to then take steps. We're going to have discussion points, or we can set up a group, or we can think about our recruitment processes. There's so many areas that you have to look at, but you have to be strategic about it. And not only that, it can't be seen as a tick box. This is vitally important for society as a whole. So I would say to make sure that you do what you say you're going to do. If you're saying you have a problem with lack of Black or LGBTQI leaders within your organizations, then think about what steps you're going to take to improve those outcomes for you. And it may be small. Sorry about the noise, if you can hear it. It may be small. It may be that you go into schools and start opening the minds of those young people and trying to say, look, we do apprenticeships. Come into our organizations. We will welcome you because we see that you have talent. So I think be strategic, be curious, learn, and take action.
That's brilliant, and it's a really brilliant point, Denise. And actually, I wonder from the Speakers Collective point of view, if the collaborative would like to have even a 15-minute meeting with representatives from the collective in 3 months' time to put down a few notes. I think that would be really cool, and we can then go back to Denise and Sunisha and say, well, this, you know, with all of the work we're doing, and as a result of this seminar and others, these are the bullet points that have gone forward. I think that could be a really positive thing. Love that. And Sunisha, do you have anything that you would like to close with? Any final thought that you want everyone to remember from this seminar?
To really just reaffirm yourself with your understanding of inclusion and diversity and equity and all these terms that have been thrown around all the time. Really, what does these words mean for you when you're thinking about microaggressions? What are your own microaggressions? What microaggressions are you maybe not aware of, particularly for what different types of communities? And I think to keep aligning yourself with opportunities to share your power and privilege. And so my challenge for this year, for 2022, for the collaborative is, how are you going to share power and privilege? What does that look like? And as today is Holocaust Memorial Day, I think it's just important for us to just take a few moments after this session and to just think about the impact and the importance for a global need for change to ensure that we can create an equitable society for everyone, and we never go back to the horrors of the past.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And yeah, it's Holocaust Memorial Day today. It's also LGBTQIA plus History Month next month. So not that I think we necessarily need certain dates to think about certain things, but it is useful to have things in the calendar to make sure. Maybe this morning I will read a little bit about that community, and just, you know, as a good way to start your day. I'd personally like to finish by entirely stealing from Denise, because I absolutely love the quote of diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and belonging is dancing like there's no one watching. I think it would be such a lovely aim for the collaborative and all organizations that we speak with if we can get every single employee into that belonging, like get everyone dancing like there's no one watching. I think that's a really, really nice thing. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, Denise. As I said before, there is a lot of emotional labor in our speakers letting you into their lives and their history. So I really, really want to thank our speakers for that. Denise and Sunisha, you've been absolutely wonderful. We have been from the Speakers Collective, and I will happily hand back to David to close the session.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adrian. Really, my job now is a quick minute or two, just really to do around the thank yous and a little bit of a word around next steps, really. So, firstly, just to say a huge thank you to Adrian, Denise, and Sunisha. I think you've gauged the vibe in the virtual room, if that makes sense, in terms of the comments and the feedback and the questions in the chat box. I think been a fantastic morning in terms of listening to your lived experience, your professional viewpoint on where we are, and then leading us into that space of, and how can we challenge ourselves and others and lead for improvement across the public sector in the Northwest. So I think fantastic, you know, use of a few hours, and thank you very much for everything that you've done, you know, with us today. Secondly, is just a thank you to everybody who's participated. I think at the highest count there's over 150 people spending the morning, investing some time and energy, and being prepared to challenge themselves and others in this space. I think that's a testament to the level of commitment across the region in terms of making improvements and positive steps forward in this space. The session, like we say, was brought to you by the Northwest Collaborative. It's part of an overall learning series, and some formal evaluation would be really appreciated in terms of today's session. I can see that's already been posted in the chat box, and I believe that will be followed up on email as well. So we'd really encourage everybody, if you can, just spend a minute or two to give us some formal evaluation of the event. It helps us obviously plan future events, learn from how things have gone, where we can improve and the like. And then finally, I suppose just to say that our next event is on the 11th of March. So only a couple of weeks away, unbelievably, 11th of March. And that's all around behaviour change and what works well. And that's being delivered in partnership with Empower Consulting. So a little bit of a plug for the next event, and a thank you to, and a please to help us evaluate today's event. So thank you very much, everybody. It's my pleasure to bring it to a close. Thanks for attending, and thank you again to Denise, Sunisha, and Adrian. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.